what makes him so special? I mean, there are many special characters in the history of Western democracy, if you will, and many other related organizations, related approaches to government. But what makes him so special that you would focus that way?
Well, I think what I thought was so special about him when I didn't know much were the speeches. And he gave these wonderful speeches during World War II, which I can't remember because I wasn't there. I was born in 1953, but certainly my parents remembered them, and they made a big difference during the war. But nowadays, people don't remember those as much, and what I think is so special about him really is the books he wrote. He wrote about 40 books, and in addition to holding all the great offices of state in Britain, but his writing career was actually even a little bit longer than his political career.
Let's take a quick bio of him so people can sort of relate to the high points of it. So I remember, for example, that he was in the Navy, right? He was a big Navy guy.
He was, but actually he began in the Army.
Okay.
He was in the 4th Hussars. He went to the British military academy called Sandhurst. And
so that was his essential training at
yes,
Sandhurst. Okay.
He learned how to blow up bridges and all sorts of things like that, and he enjoyed it very much. And he then went on to fight in 4 wars before he was elected to Parliament at age 26. And the 4 wars were on 3 different continents.
Britain was very active in those days.
Well, the first war actually was the Spanish War against the Cubans. And he was just there to observe, but he did get shot at on his 21st birthday. And he decided, he actually learned several things from going to Cuba. He learned to like daiquiris, which hadn't come to America yet. That happened only 3 years later. And he learned to like siestas, which he got into the habit of taking all his life.
Interesting.
But he did get a medal with the Spaniards, and he eventually got a second medal from the Spanish king. But the 3 subsequent wars he was in were actually British engagements.
Going
these
back,
little wars of the Queen.
Are you talking about the War of 1898, the Spanish-American
No,
War?
not quite. But it's what provoked that. The Spaniards were fighting a guerrilla war in Cuba against the Cubans who wanted to be independent. And the Americans were certainly sympathetic to the Cubans, but we hadn't gotten mixed up yet.
Okay.
So this was in 1895, 3 years before that.
So just doing the math, we're talking about a fellow who was born in the 1870s.
1874.
So
on the 30th
he's
of
older
November.
than I thought. 30th November. What time exactly?
I don't know. I think he was born in the evening, but don't hold me to it. I know that his parents were at Blenheim Palace, which was the family's ancestral seat, but it wasn't their house. They were there as guests. Lord Randolph, his father, grew up there. His father was the Duke. But he wasn't the eldest surviving son. He was the second surviving son.
He was royalty of a sort or what?
No, he is part of the British aristocracy.
Okay.
But he was only called a lord by courtesy because his father was a duke. Dukes, I don't know that much about this, but I've learned more about it. Dukes are the second highest level under kings. So they're the highest level of aristocracy in the British hierarchy.
It's fading fast.
Yes, and it was then too. And Churchill actually was a commoner, as his father was, because his father wasn't the heir to the dukedom. So that's why he was able to be in the House of Commons. See, otherwise he would have been stuck in the House of Lords, which wasn't very important.
Not as much action there.
Right.
Okay, so you hit on one war.
Well, the first war he went to as an Englishman, not just as an observer, was the war in what's now the boundary between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's right where all the bad guys are that we're trying to get. But it was then the frontiers of India. And it was a war against rebellious tribesmen in Waziristan and places like that we occasionally read about in the papers.
And the year?
1898.
Okay.
And Churchill wrote a book about it, his first book, which he wrote in 6 weeks.
He
And,
did have a way with the language.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah. So what was his experience in that war?
Well, he was more than shot at in that war. There were a lot of punitive expeditions against tribesmen who had been sniping at British soldiers and at transportation and so on. And they went up to punish them by cutting down trees, filling up wells, burning down houses, and so on. Tribesmen were not happy with that. And so they used to attack the British soldiers, the British officers really, and sick soldiers, mostly native soldiers from India, when they began to withdraw from these punitive expeditions. And Churchill was in some very, very dicey retreats. He wasn't wounded, but he saw a lot of action and a lot of people who died or were injured.
So in what way was this formative for him, you know, that it played
Well,
out
it taught him
later
that war wasn't just fun.
Yeah.
And that there was really a danger and a possible forfeit. And it made him wonder whether this kind of punitive expedition was a good idea or whether it had been done right. And so, though he had written some dispatches from Cuba too, this was his first book. And it made him a little bit obnoxious to the Army because they didn't like the idea of an officer also being a reporter.
And criticizing the
And
strategies and all that, yeah.
Commanding officers and that sort of thing. Churchill was fairly tactful, but they didn't really like it. And so his getting to the Third War was much harder because the commanding officer, Lord Kitchener, didn't want him. Now, Churchill had two aces in the hole. One was the Prime Minister happened to read his book, Lord Salisbury, and called him in to talk about it. And he liked the book, and this was the first time Churchill was in the Prime Minister's office at 10 Downing Street in 1898. And it was July, and this war in the Sudan against the dervishes, who were way up the Nile at Khartoum, had been going on for 2 years, and it was about to reach the climax. Kitchener was commanding the troops. They had built a railroad across the Sahara Desert to cut off a long loop of the Nile.
These were the days of empire.
It was amazing. They had gunboats that they had taken apart and carried up in pieces. They had gotten tribesmen to pull the various kinds of smaller boats up the river. They had camels, they had horses.
Queen Victoria was the queen at the time?
Queen Victoria was still the queen, right. These were the
Wonderful
Queen's
days
little
they were,
wars.
you know.
And Churchill wanted to be in at the climactic battle.
Yeah.
Kitchener, the commanding officer, didn't want him there. And even when the Prime Minister asked him as a favor to take Churchill as an extra staff officer, he refused.
Ooh.
Well, Churchill figured out that there was one small British contingent together with the Anglo-Egyptian army, and Kitchener didn't have a say over who was in that contingent. And so he got them to assign him as an extra officer to that. It was a cavalry outfit.
So the side door.
The 21st Lancers. And Churchill got there just in time to write 15 dispatches on that war, sitting in the Sahara Desert in temperatures of 115 degrees after he'd marched 25 miles during the day, in August, so the hottest time of the year, and then writing a book about it after.
What did he say in the dispatches in the book? This is probably his greatest contribution to the war, wasn't it? What he was saying about it.
Well, this book he called The River War. Of course, the river was the Nile, and it was published a year later. So he actually worked for a whole year on this book.
More serious than the first.
2 volumes, lots of fold-out maps and illustrations by one of his brother officers in the 21st Lancers.
You have both of these books, don't you?
Well, as a matter of fact, yes and no. The second one, The River War, the one I'm talking about, was published in 3,000 copies only.
That's not
And it was a
much.
very expensive book, 36 shillings, which means nothing to me, but it's like a book that costs a couple $100 now. And so they sold most of the 3,000 copies, but Churchill had criticized Kitchener, the commanding officer, rather severely, both damning by faint praise and some actual criticism.
But he had nothing to lose. Kitchener wasn't his friend anyway.
No, it's true. The war was against the dervishes, who were Muslims who had taken over the Sudan from Egypt, which had controlled it for about half a century and ruled it very badly. And they had killed Gordon, Charles Gordon, who was the British agent in Khartoum and who became a martyr and a hero in Britain 13 years earlier when they took power. And it took the British a long time to avenge Gordon and to take the Sudan back. And they might have done it partly because they were afraid the French had eyes on it, not so much because of
European
revenge.
competition, yeah.
Right. But they did eventually, and Churchill was in the cavalry charge during that battle, which was one of the last cavalry charges, and it was very dangerous.
You know, what's funny is we all remember him as a kind of a fellow who ate very well, who had a cane, as I recall, who was really he didn't look like much of an athlete, and yet you're describing a guy in a cavalry charge. That's different.
He's in his early 20s, and he's pretty fit. But he had wrenched his shoulder in India getting off a boat in the harbor at Bombay. And as a result, he wasn't sure that he'd be able to drive home a sword in a cavalry charge. So he'd bought a Mauser pistol right before going to the Sudan, the latest model. And he used it several times during that battle.
Maybe
and
saved
it
his
may be
life.
the reason why he wasn't killed,
Yeah.
because a number of the other British cavalry officers were. What happened was they charged into a water course, a dry water course because it was summer, thinking they were charging against 200 or 300 dervishes. And it turned out there were more like 2,600 dervishes in that water course. And there were only about 200 of the British cavalry.
So then
The
you can't
officers
get out
and
so
troopers.
easily. You're in there.
No, and the bugle sounded the charge, and they charged, and it was pretty dicey down
The
there.
days of glory.
Most of the British casualties in that battle were in that cavalry charge, because most of the casualties in the battle, thousands of them, were on the dervish side, and they came from the fact that the dervishes had old trashy rifles and shields and spears and other things. And the British had gunboats and machine guns, so it wasn't a very fair battle. The hard part was getting down there, or rather up there, up the Nile. And across the Sahara Desert. That was difficult. You asked me whether I had the book. The thing is that the first edition was abridged by Churchill 3 years later, and it was sort of the equivalent of a book going into paperback. The publisher said, "We want a shorter book, just one volume, cheaper binding, we'll sell some more copies," and they did. But Churchill had to cut out quite a bit. By then he'd been elected to Parliament, and
And he didn't want to offend anyone.
he was less eager to offend people, and so he cut out a lot of the criticisms, and he softened some of them too. And he also cut out a lot of the autobiographical things. He got lost in the desert, for instance. Now, this is a funny story. You mentioned he liked to eat. This was not just in his old age. And so when he got to Cairo, he, of course, made friends with the British agent, Lord Cromer, ended up with some letter paper from Lord Cromer's office on which he wrote most of these dispatches. But he also inquired as to how much gear he was allowed to take as an officer. And he was very surprised that he was allowed to take 200 pounds of gear, which was a very large amount in those days. But then he discovered that unlike the situation in India, he had to pay for the transport of the gear.
You
He
can
was
take
allowed
it,
to take
but-
200 pounds, but he had to pay for it. Well, he had already bought the 200 pounds worth of gear when he discovered this. And so he decided he had to get rid of a good deal of it, lest he be charged dragging it all the way up to Khartoum. And so it took him a while to get rid of what he had bought. And as a result, he was a little bit late setting off, and he had to set off alone. He got lost in the desert.
Trying to find Khartoum.
And was able to find his way because of the Nile, and eventually got reunited with his unit before they got near Khartoum. But he describes that incident in the book, and that's part of what was cut out when the book was abridged. He also describes his visit to the battlefield 3 days later. Now, the battle was September 2nd, 1898. The temperatures during the day were over 110 at that time of year. And most of the dervishes who had been killed were from far away and had no family to help them. So a lot of those poor men who were wounded lay out there without any help and without any water and died.
Mm.
And the picture of the battlefield and the sight of it, and even the smell of it, after 3 days when Churchill went out with another officer who was a friend of his, and helped him actually. The friend had a little surgical experience, and he was able to take bullets out of some people, and they were able to give them a little water till their water ran out, and so on. But the description of that is really remarkable and memorable. I mean, it's the kind of chapter you won't forget if you've read it.
Mm-hmm.
And that chapter was cut out when the book was abridged.
You have both, or you have one?
Well, what I have numerous copies of the first edition, and that's because I've been doing a new edition of it, which I hope will come out finally next year. But the only copies I actually have of the book are of the abridged edition. When I was on my wedding trip in London years and years ago, I discovered that there was this much longer edition of this book. And it also has Churchill's criticism of Islam, which he cut out because it wasn't politically
also
correct.
impolitic, yeah.
Right. I mean, after all, there were a lot of Muslim people in the British Empire.
Even
and
then.
So, right. Well, especially then.
Yeah.
And so I thought really there ought to be a copy of a new edition. And the differences are very interesting. And so what the new edition will have, it shows what Churchill first wrote and then how it was changed when it was abridged. And over the years, I've actually found the original dispatches Churchill wrote, which were lost for a long time because the newspaper in which they were published, the Morning Post, went bankrupt and closed sometime in the 30s. But eventually the papers of the owner of the newspaper were donated to an archive at Leeds in Britain. And so for the last 15 or 20 years, we've had those, but they've never been published. Of course, they were published in the paper, but the editor in the newspaper cut out a lot of what Churchill wrote and changed it. And so in this new edition, we've actually published the dispatches the way Churchill wrote them. He intended them as a kind of a literary product, and he wrote them with this pretense because of the sensitivity of his writing. He pretended that he was writing them to a friend to let him know what the war was like, and that the friend, without his knowledge or consent, leaked them to the newspapers.
Perfect.
And so most of that conceit...
That kind of thing happens today, too.
It happens, and maybe even people pretend that it happened. I don't know. But it's interesting. Most of that conceit was cut out by the editor. And so it'll be rather fun to have these dispatches published
So
the way they
you're
actually
writing
were.
the book of the changes, the book of
Right.
change.
What I'm doing is I'm editing Churchill's book. And the new edition was affected also by my teaching it. You know, I've taught it to students for a number of years, and the students found that Churchill was constantly referring to people they'd never heard of, and they wanted to know a little more about this and that. And so gradually, I've written probably 3, 4, 5,000 footnotes for the book, explaining things.
Oh, great.
You know, he mentions a certain railroad, some
Well, that's
explanation
great.
of that.
So you spread out. You're
Exactly.
looking at the times in general.
Or he mentions some funny African disease, guinea worm, which involves, you know, getting a worm up to 3 feet long in your leg, and then it gradually comes out very painfully. And he has a kind of gruesome description of this disease and other.
You've done a pretty good job yourself.
Well, I'm glad I don't have it. The disease has mostly been eradicated, by the way, now, thanks to the Carter Center, which has put a lot of money into eradicating it in Africa. But in the Sudan, because of the Civil War, the disease still exists.
Oh, what a shame.
So, in fact, in the very place Churchill heard about it, it's still there.
So now this is the second, third war.
That's the third war. Right. The fourth war was bigger, South Africa. The Boer War.
What year was that?
Well, see, Churchill was in this Sudan War in 1898. The South African War was in 1899. It broke out in late October. Churchill got there right at the end of the month of October. His book, The River War, was published November 6th, while he was already in South Africa at his next war. And by
Getting to be a folk hero.
by the middle of November, Churchill had been captured by the Boers.
Oh my God.
Here's what happened. He wanted to get where the action was. He had resigned from the army. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just a correspondent. He was the highest paid British war correspondent ever. Morning Post had hired him back for a lot of money.
That's because he wrote candid stuff.
Yeah. Well, he was good.
He was good.
He was good. Everyone read him. And he had just published this book, or he was about to. So that was his second book. And he went down there very eager to see action. And so he went right to the place in Natal where Ladysmith, which was a town there, a British town, had been invested by the Boers. It was one of a couple of towns that was surrounded. And he got there just too late to get inside Ladysmith before the encirclement was complete. But he was on an armored train commanded by a friend of his. And the train went out into hostile territory. The Boers put big boulders on the tracks. Then they attacked it. And gradually everybody realized what they should have known beforehand, that an armored train is not really a very safe thing to be on. I mean, it can only go one way. And so if you block the track,
You can
and what the
take the train out.
Exactly. And what the Boers did was they derailed the train. And what Churchill, who was just a correspondent, though he did have his pistol with him, did, was he organized the British troops on the train as a help to the commanding officer, to his friend. They pushed the overturned cars off the track. They got the wounded soldiers onto the car behind that. They pushed that back up to where they could connect it to the engine, and they got most of the wounded away. But Churchill then ran back to help some of the other people, and at that point he was captured.
You know this in such great detail because it was in another book or in the dispatches, or
It was another book, but I've also been to South Africa for 3 weeks looking around and going to all these places.
And the
So I can
reason
picture it very well.
The
because I've
reason
been
you went
there.
to South Africa was to examine this very thing.
Right,
Okay.
exactly. That was, in 93. And Churchill was captured and taken to Pretoria, the Boer capital. He was put in jail at the State Model School, which was a normal school that had been turned into a prison for officers. And he chafed. He hated it.
Oh.
He got people to do a big map of the war on the wall inside, and he followed the developments avidly. They obviously didn't guard him, or they didn't have a very tough regime for British officers in this prison. He was allowed to buy a civilian suit and a hat. And as he says in one of his books, the walls of the prison didn't pose much of an obstacle to anyone with the ordinary activity of youth. I've seen the walls. He climbed over the top of a latrine and over the wall one night, and there were a couple of other people who were going to escape with him, but they missed the chance, so he was the only one who got out. And he left a letter on his pillow to one of the Boer officials who had been nice to him, apologizing that he didn't have a chance to say goodbye, and telling him he looked forward to meeting him again when the British captured Pretoria. And off he went into the night.
Yeah.
And he escaped by jumping onto a train like a hobo, which is not so easy. He figured out that the train would be going more slowly uphill, and he found a place where it was going uphill fairly slowly. Jumping off was worse, though, because the train wasn't going so slowly, and he was sort of lurching into a field, and then he didn't know where he was. He jumped off because he was afraid he might be on the wrong train, and in any case, he thought the train might be searched. And then he waited for another train the next night, but there wasn't one. And he wandered a long time, and finally he decided that he was really in need of giving up. I've traced this route, and what he did is physically quite a feat. He was in his 20s, and he was in pretty good shape. He was a cavalry officer, but still. And this was December, which is the hottest time of the year. Well, actually, yeah, it was December, because he escaped December 12th. So it was the hottest time of the year in South Africa. He walked, as it turned out, right into a British mine that had been allowed to keep operating, even though its owners were British, because the Boers needed the coal.
Mm-hmm.
And they
Took him in.
And hid him in the mine. And they hid him in the mine until they could figure out how to get him onto the train in a box as cargo. And he then took the train across the border into Portuguese West Africa, which we call Mozambique now, to Lourenço Marques, which is now Maputo.
The capital.
Right. And walked up to the British consulate, and the consul said, "Go away, we're not open." And Churchill, who probably looked pretty disreputable after living in a box for 3 days, insisted, and pretty soon he was on a steamer going back to Durban in South Africa, because there were a lot of Boer sympathizers in Maputo, and they were kind of worried that somebody might try to grab him and put him back in confinement.
So
this made him a hero. This was actually when Churchill, in his own right, first became famous. His father had been a famous politician. He had been Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was the one who annexed Burma while he was Secretary of State for India. And he was the son of the Duke of Marlborough. So he was not an insignificant figure, but this really was when Winston became famous in his own right.
that means everybody in England knew who he was.
Right. I mean, the thing was, the British had had no good fortune at the beginning of the Boer War. It was defeat or disappointment after defeat. And then Churchill escapes. So now they had something to be happy about.
Iconic.
Yeah.
Well, that's so okay.
So that's really
the
how
year
he got
there
his
is-
start.
Have we gotten to 1900 yet?
Not quite, because he escaped in time to be with his countrymen at Christmas, 1899. But we're just at the turn of the century, if you think it happens at the end of
So what have we got?
1899.
At that time, at the turn of the century, we've got a hero. We got a fellow with some connections in the government,
Right.
the nobility. We got somebody who is quick on his feet, can get around in difficult physical situations, and we got somebody who can write up a storm. He can write well.
Right. He wrote 2 more books about his adventures in South
Made
Africa.
him more of a hero.
One of them was about his capture and escape, mostly.
Yeah.
The other one was about his experiences back in the Army, because the first thing he did was re-enlist.
Why?
Well, he wanted to be where the action was, and he was hoping to win some medals. And, of course, there was a big obstacle to this. There was a rule they'd made that you couldn't be an officer and a war correspondent at the same time. It was called the Churchill Rule.
He was making trouble.
He was the one who broke the Churchill rule. But they couldn't really say no to him because he was the hero now.
Sure.
So he actually was one of the people who liberated the prison that he had been in Pretoria.
More of a hero.
Yeah, and as soon as that happened, pretty much, the war died down into a kind of guerrilla effort. And Churchill went home, and he ran for Parliament the second time. He had been defeated the first time. And he ran the second time, and this time was elected.
As a hero.
And that was in the fall of 1900. By then, he had published the book on India, The Story of the Malacan Field Force. This book I'm working on the new edition of, The River War. 2 books on South Africa, and a novel called Savrola.
Which was about?
Well, it was about...
Autobiographical, maybe?
Slightly, perhaps, but mostly it was about a revolution in an imaginary Balkan country called Laurania against an authoritarian, kind of a nasty military dictator by a young man who in some ways, but not always, is like Churchill, who falls in love with the dictator's beautiful young wife and runs off with her.
This could be relevant today.
Well, actually, the same publisher that's doing The River War is about to do a new edition of Savrola, which a friend of mine is editing. And Savrola is the novel. It's interesting because...
Writing novels sounds like he's really focusing on his writing now.
Well, the novel, interestingly enough, was the first book Churchill started to write. He started writing it in 1897, the year before the campaign that produced the first book. But it took a little while longer to be published. And it was first published in America as a book, and then almost immediately afterward in Britain, as many of his books were published in both places from the beginning. And that caused some confusion, because there was an American author who was perhaps about as famous in America as, say, a guy like Stephen King is today, named Winston Churchill, who was from New Hampshire. He had been a state legislator in New Hampshire, and even ran for governor of Massachusetts once. So he was a New Englander. And he was called Winston Churchill, and he had published all these novels. And people used to study them in English departments. I don't think anyone does anymore much. But what's funny is people mixed up the books.
Yeah.
And people still do.
Yeah.
I have a whole shelf full of Winston Churchill books
Yeah.
that are by the wrong Winston Churchill that people have given me.
You'd think there'd only be one Winston Churchill, but no.
No, well, what was funny was in 1900, Churchill came to America before he took his seat in Parliament to give a lecture tour, America and Canada. And while he was in Boston, he and Winston Churchill had dinner, and the bill went to the wrong Churchill. But they did meet each other.
We don't blame them, though.
No.
So we have about 20 minutes left, and I mean, I wish we
We'll
we
have to
could
speed up a little. Right?
Yeah, but I wonder if, gee, I'd like to continue this right into all the detail. It's too interesting.
Well, the Navy thing that you mentioned really came after Churchill was in Parliament, and he began to get cabinet positions. He quit the Conservative Party and became a liberal, which of course made the Tories hate him, and think he was a traitor to his class.
He didn't mind if he was unpopular.
No, he was certainly willing to be unpopular, although at that point the Conservative government was unpopular. So this was actually a smart move politically, perhaps. But he held a number of cabinet positions, and then World War I looked like it was about to happen. And 3 years before World War I broke out, the Prime Minister Asquith appointed him First Lord of the Admiralty, which is like being Navy Secretary. And he did it because he thought Churchill would be better at helping the Army and Navy to work together than the previous First Lord of the Admiralty had been. And Churchill did have the Navy ready when World War I broke out. But he lost his position because of the Dardanelles, this attack on Constantinople.
That was a failure.
it failed, although by then it had become a military attack as well, and Churchill wasn't really responsible for the military part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really clear whether he ought to be blamed for what happened, but he was, and he was the scapegoat.
But just a footnote to all this is that, gee, there's a lot of wars going on in those days, and it reminds me a little of that book, Barbara Tuchman,
The Guns of War.
The Guns of August.
The Guns of August, right.
Yeah, where everybody knew that World War I was going to happen years beforehand. All these things building up, and an observer, not necessarily a sophisticated one, could tell. Every country could tell this was happening. Well, that's different than what happens these days. Lots of wars.
Right.
It was like a way of life. And he was right in the middle of it. He knew about war.
Well, he was. He, in fact, fought in World War I, because after he lost his cabinet position, he went back. The Prime Minister had been offered a position as a general, and the Prime Minister said, no, you can only be a colonel, which was very disappointing to him. But he actually fought in the trenches on the Western Front in Belgium. I've been to the places, and it was very, very dicey there. A lot of people died.
Sure.
And the troops were not too pleased about having this politician who came with his bathtub and so on to command them. But Churchill won them over. And he'd also started painting by then. This was a hobby that he found very comforting after his disappointment over the Dardanelles. He was very much down in the dumps. His wife said she thought he would die of grief. And he just happened to discover oil painting. And from then on, for all the decades of his life, wherever he went, he took his paints and painted. And so we have some paintings of shells exploding in World War I that he painted when he was, in a little farmhouse in Belgium on the front.
Do you have? Do you have any of his work?
No, I wish I had his paintings. They sell for about $1 million each.
Oh my goodness!
But
he must have been good then.
He was pretty good. He was an amateur painter, and he didn't try to pretend otherwise. But he did a couple of times enter paintings into amateur art contests. And he was disqualified once because they said he couldn't possibly be an amateur.
Too much the hero.
And he painted 500 or 600 paintings.
Prolific.
Yeah.
So we have a man emerging with extraordinary energy and talent and sort of joie de vivre. He could grab everything and do anything.
It's really true. There's this famous story about Churchill, which, unlike some stories about Churchill, is true. And it has to do with his coming to New York and staying in a hotel. People in the British aristocracy in his generation didn't stay in hotels that much. They stayed with friends. And Churchill did have friends in New York, but Bernard Baruch, for instance. But he did stay occasionally in hotels. And the manager called the room thinking that somebody would be up there from Churchill's party and said, is there anything special Mr. Churchill likes? And Churchill had picked up the phone himself. And he said, I'm easily satisfied with the very best.
They'll never forget that one.
Right.
Well,
but actually, this book that you have your hands on
yes.
is one of Churchill's books. It has kind of a neat cartoon of Churchill in the 1920s on the cover. And it's a book he published in 1932, which had been out of print for a number of years, and it happened to be the very first Churchill book I ever read. And I really loved it, and I wanted to be able to teach it to students, so I did a new edition of it 2 years ago. And that I really recommend for anybody who's intrigued by Churchill. It's called Thoughts and Adventures, and it's a book that has essays on painting, on flying. Churchill was an early aviator. Even before 1910, he was up in the air flying. It has a chapter on what it would be like to live your life over again, and it has essays on his experiences at war, one on elections, which is quite funny, a spy story, and some very intriguing essays toward the end. You'll see them here. One called Shall We All Commit Suicide, which is about modern weapons and their dangers, mass effects in modern life, and one published in 1932, 50 Years Hence, which is about what he thinks things will be like in 50 years.
Futuristic.
Which is kind of fun to read now. Also one on Moses, which he didn't write. It was ghostwritten by a Rhodes Scholar. But mostly he wrote this book himself, and it's a very good instance of Churchill's journalism. All these pieces were written for magazines. He wrote for Cosmopolitan. He wrote for Popular Mechanics. He wrote for all sorts of different journals. And then some of the better essays he wrote were collected and reprinted in this book.
It's
So-
replete. I mean, it's got an awful lot of material in here. It's altogether almost 400 pages long.
Right. Well, what we managed to do, I have a British collaborator who is very good on military titles and all sorts of things that I might not necessarily know how to get right myself. And we worked pretty hard on this book and wrote hundreds of notes identifying different things in it. And I think ISI Books did a very nice job publishing it.
So this material that he wrote in your book that you put together would have taken us through the 20s or
Yes,
into the-
all these essays were written in the 20s or very early 30s.
So now we have a guy who's beginning to form up, and it's so interesting is the I don't know, this is an engraving.
It's a cartoon,
Cartoon,
by
that-
Lowe, who's a famous British cartoonist of Churchill in the 20s.
And he looks like the Churchill we remember. Maybe
Well,
I mean,
he's got the polka dotted tie. He has the cigar. He has the dark suit, and he's pretty bald already. He has these sort of spats and what are called, I think, spectator shoes, which are kind of typically British. But yes,
but he's kind of informal though. He's in a very informal pose.
right.
So there's a statement there, and he seems to be looking down in a kind of I don't know, if it's a thoughtful pose. or-
Right, bug-eyed,
Bug-eyed,
kind of.
yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
Well, I always loved that cartoon. Churchill did too, and there's an essay on cartoons in the book.
Really.
Well, he says that when politicians don't matter anymore, people stop making cartoons of them. So first they get mad at the cartoons they don't like, and then they get mad because they don't like that there aren't any more cartoons of them.
But he looks pretty well formed up here to the image that most people have of him,
Right.
or had of him in the later years of his life. In fact, during the war, and certainly in retrospect now. And it sounds like he's well on his way to where he was going. Here
Right. In the 20s, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer again, after holding a number of cabinet ministries. But then all during the 30s, when this book was published and many others, including his greatest work, which is The Life of Marlborough, which is in print, by the way, if somebody wants
Really?
to get
Wow.
it. Yeah, nice edition from University of Chicago Press. That, I think, is really his greatest work. It's about his great ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, who beat Louis XIV. And Churchill studied him very carefully in the 30s, wrote 4-volume biography of him, because that was his model for how Hitler could be beaten. And he was studying how you defeat a continental tyrant and with an alliance. And of course that persuaded
This
him
is
that he
really
had to
important
make sure
stuff.
no distance got between him and Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And they became great friends gradually. And when Churchill came back to the Admiralty in 1939, when war broke out, you know, we forget, because of Pearl Harbor, that the war broke out for Britain in 1939, more than 2 years before America got into it formally. And during that time, Roosevelt was helping Britain about as much as he thought he could, but there were serious limits on how far
Politically,
he could go.
sure.
Right.
So remind me, how did it break out for England What was the provocative thing that made
Hitler invaded Poland.
and they had a
And
pact
France and Britain had both agreed that if somebody invaded Poland, they would go to war.
Okay, so there we were.
So Chamberlain was very reluctant, and he waited 2 or 3 days, but eventually Britain had to go to war.
Yeah. And at the time, Churchill was back in the Exchequer?
No, he had been Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 20s, and nobody had given him any cabinet office since 1929. For a whole 10 years, he was out of power in the wilderness.
What was he doing?
He was warning about Hitler, and nobody wanted to hear about it.
Smart.
And you see, when war broke out, the pressure to bring him back, that's this button, send for Churchill. That's what people were saying in the late 30s. Things were bad, we needed him back in the government.
Back. Yeah.
And when the war broke out, Chamberlain couldn't resist the pressure and named him First Lord of the Admiralty again. And then, of course,
he was the right man for the time.
9 months later, that government fell and Churchill became Prime Minister on the 10th of May.
So Chamberlain wanted him back because Chamberlain needed to have him back.
He needed him back. He probably wasn't too happy that he had to have him back because he didn't want the war to break out. But once it had,
That's interesting.
and see, when Chamberlain's government fell in 1940, there was an all-party government with the Labour Party and the Liberals too. By then, Churchill had gone back to the Conservatives. But it wasn't just a conservative government during the war. It was an all-party government, which he was head of.
So now he was the man most ready to handle Britain's affairs during the war.
He certainly
was
was.
prepared for it.
He had been anticipating this ever since he first learned about Hitler. And he had been paying attention to Hitler and warning about Hitler in these newspaper columns for 10 years.
And thinking about alliances.
Thinking
and
about
how
what
to deal
needed
with
to
a
be
continental tyrant and all that.
Right.
Yeah. And thinking that Chamberlain was really all wet.
Right. Although Churchill was very gentle to Chamberlain after the change. Mm-hmm. And he gave a famous eulogy to Chamberlain when Chamberlain died within the year, saying that Chamberlain had done his best. The one he really blamed was Chamberlain's predecessor, Stanley Baldwin, who said, "I didn't rearm because it would have lost me the election." Churchill thought that was unforgivable. Chamberlain, he thought, was wrong, but he was well-meaning.
So here we are now, and the war is going. Churchill is the prime minister. How well does he do in rearming at that point and getting things going to prepare for what was going to be a difficult time?
Well, Britain was in a terrible situation, and it really needed help from the United States, which it got finally, first by the Lend-Lease Agreement, which gave them some old ships we didn't need, and then with all sorts of men and materiel. There were a lot of Americans who enlisted in the British Army before we went to war, and there were a lot who supported the British Army, and of course the Canadians helped a lot. But as I said, 2 whole years before we got involved, and that included the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, all those famous moments.
Hard times.
Yeah, and of course France was overrun within a month after Churchill became prime minister, or a month and a half, and then Britain was all alone for a very long time.
So you have a big morale problem.
Until Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, that was important. Because
Galvanized.
then, of course, Stalin came in as an ally.
Yeah.
That had its own problems, but
at least there was somebody else.
right.
So, my expectation would be, with all the things you describe, in that early part of the war, Britain was demoralized, and its people felt that they were unprepared and in bad shape to deal with a really difficult situation.
Well,
and
they
here's
certainly
now,
were.
Churchill has the ability to reach him. His whole life has been directed at being able to reach people and maybe changing the morale problem. And I guess that's what happened.
Well, he really inspired his fellow cabinet members and the other people in the British government, and then through his speeches, the British nation as well. And Hitler somehow knew this was the tough nut to crack, and they were expecting Germans on the beaches anytime that fall.
Scary,
But it
yeah.
never quite happened.
Yeah.
The Channel is a very good anti-tank obstacle. And it was always something Hitler was going to do later, but he never was able to do it.
When I was in school, we studied the relative speech-making powers of FDR versus Churchill versus Hitler.
Mhm.
We didn't talk much about Stalin because he couldn't make a speech to save himself. as
Well, I don't think
recall.
we have much in the way of speeches from Stalin.
Yeah. But in those days, I mean, it really made a difference to make a good speech. To wit, that recent movie, The King's Speech,
Yes.
which came at the same time. Am I right? I mean, make a speech, you really change things in those days.
You know, Churchill grew up reading his father's speeches in the newspaper. They used to be published verbatim, and people would read them. And his father wasn't even the prime minister. But this was how you followed politics. And people followed politics the way they follow sports now,
Mm-hmm.
some quite avidly.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no TV, and at the beginning there was no radio, no movies. So, I mean, for public entertainment, you read the speeches in the newspapers. Things changed a lot in the course of Churchill's life. He was never really first rate on TV, although he was beginning to learn how to do it at the very end of his life. But he was old by then. He was in his 80s. He was very good on the radio. And, of course, Roosevelt was too, but a different style. Roosevelt was more conversational.
Mm-hmm.
Churchill was more rousing or inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for people who know those speeches, one of the interesting revelations about these books is there's a lot of Churchillian rhetoric and sort of rousing writing in the books, but there's also a lot of lyrical, kind of funny, humorous, rueful writing. One book I haven't mentioned is Churchill's autobiography, My Early Life. Still in print, published in 1930. I've been in the early stages of working on a new edition of that book. But that's a wonderful book. It's an adventure story. You know, it tells about all these wars he was in, and it has lots of humor, lots of laughing at himself, and interesting little portraits of people he met and got to know and so on.
Well, he was a great man, and your organization, if it is an organization, your Churchillian organization bears witness to that. But what is it about him that made him a great man? What is it about him that makes you spend your time with him and about him and others? What is it about him that puts him down in the annals of history?
Well, I think his understanding of politics really is a good corrective to all sorts of modern political science that you can study. He has an understanding of politics that emphasizes the importance of prudence or practical wisdom. In other words, learning how to make the right choices. And that's something that either bad theories or some kind of ideologies often gets in the way of. But Churchill learned it by experience. He learned it first through his experience of people his father knew, people his father brought home to dinner, older people who became friends of his, and in some cases were friends all their lives till they died. His father died when Churchill was only 20. So some of those people became kind of surrogate fathers or at least uncles to him. Mm-hmm. And helped him find his feet in politics when he was just starting, since his father wasn't there. But I think another thing that attracts people to Churchill are all the stories about him and all the wonderful, funny things he said. There's a book by the fellow who edits this Churchill Center magazine, Finest Hour, called Churchill by Himself. Mm. And I recommend that to anybody who wants to read all the funny stories about Churchill and actually know which ones are true. Because what Richard Langworth, the author, has done is to figure out what the sources for each of those stories is. And he even has a chapter in his book called Red Herrings, which is about all the stories that we've heard that
But not-
aren't really true. He's got the goods on most of them. Although, you know, it's funny, just this summer I was over in England at the Churchill Archive Center where Churchill's papers are in Cambridge. And shortly after I got back, I got an email from the director of the archives, Alan Packwood, who had been poking around in Churchill's papers and had discovered that one of my favorite Churchill stories, one involving the playwright George Bernard Shaw, wasn't true. The story goes, or went, since it's been disproved, that Shaw had one of his new plays open in London, and he sent young Churchill a couple of tickets to it. And he said, "Please come tomorrow, it's opening night, and bring a friend if you have one." And Churchill was already busy that night, and he wrote Shaw back and he said, "I'm awfully sorry I can't come the first night, but I will definitely be there the second night, if there is one." And
I don't care if it's not true.
no, I know. I loved this Churchill story all my life. But what Alan Packwood found was that somebody in the 40s wrote George Bernard Shaw when he was an old man and said, "I want to publish this story. Can you confirm that it's true?" And Shaw said, "Publish it at your peril. There's no truth to it whatsoever." And so the fellow wasn't completely daunted by that. And so he wrote Churchill and said, "You know, I've heard this story, but Shaw tells me there's no truth to it. What do you say?" And Churchill had his secretary write back that, you know, Mr. Shaw was quite correct, that there was no truth to this story. So, but that's the kind of
unanimity.
right. They had their story straight. It didn't happen, but it was a good story. But you know, a lot of the stories about Churchill are true, and they're all very nicely given in that book, Churchill by Himself.
You know, in our time, in our lives, and in the 100 years around our lives, you know, he has to be one of the greatest figures that we've seen. And rising to, you know, great occasions in history, he could never be forgotten, and he has to be studied. He's an endearing character. It's been great to talk to you about him.